Hello, ninth grade students. Hope you're doing well today. We are picking back up with Into the Clouds, page 82. Start right below the photo of the group crossing the Broadu River. On May 31st, a month after leaving Srinagar, the men stood at base camp surrounded by crates and bundles. They hadn't even begun to climb, and already they stood 2,000 feet higher than any piece of ground in the continental United States. With the mountain looming over them, they began to have their private doubts. Sheldon wrote in his journal, "A trip like this, I believe, changes boys to men. They either come through or they don't, and if they don't, it is too damn bad. But if they do, they'll be men. We shall see." Durrance was convinced he would be the one who wouldn't come through. "I'm going to die on this mountain," he thought, as the men set up their tents and organized supplies. But before he could spend too much time imagining his own demise, he had another more immediate crisis on his hands. Their very first morning in base camp, Kramer woke with a raging fever. He shook uncontrollably and couldn't keep a morsel of food down. He was coughing up a frothy green liquid, and Durrance could hear the fluid in his lungs every time he took a raspy breath. Durrance thought it might be pneumonia, but as he had told Houston, he wasn't qualified to be a doctor. He had no real idea what was wrong with Kramer. He knew only that it sounded like his friend was dying. One after another, the soiled sleeping bags piled up outside the large Logan tent. Durrance had turned the tent into a hospital, with Kramer as its lone patient. Inside, he battled to keep his friend alive. Kramer groaned with pain from diarrhea and nausea. He couldn't keep anything down. He gasped and wheezed, trying to get oxygen past the thick fluid in his airways. Durrance pressed his mouth to Kramer's and forced air into his lungs. He rocked his friend back and forth to keep the fluid from settling in one place. Delirious from fever, Kramer babbled on about a baseball game he thought he was playing back at Dartmouth. At one point, he muttered that he had a 1 in 3 chance of surviving. No amount of advice from Charlie Houston could have prepared Durrance for this. He hadn't set foot in a medical school classroom, and he suddenly found himself in charge of someone's life. Weisner and Cromwell had gone off with Kekuli to scout their route up the mountain. Wolf and Sheldon took turns caring for Kramer in the hospital tent, but they relied on Durrance to figure out what to do. Luckily for everyone, Kramer began to improve. On the third day, his nurses lifted him out of the foul-smelling tent and propped him up in a camp chair in the sun. The patient would survive, but he was done climbing before he had started. Base camp would be Kramer's home for the rest of the mission. When Weisner got back from his scouting trek, he couldn't have been thrilled with the state of the expedition. He had been counting on Kramer as one of his strongest climbers. Now the young man who'd scrambled up some of Canada's toughest peaks with Weisner couldn't get up from a chair without help. Cromwell had already announced that he wouldn't be climbing past Camp 4, and Durrance, the most experienced mountaineer in the bunch, seemed exhausted already. At 17,000 feet, he was feeling the altitude, racked by headaches and sleeplessness. And still, they had a mountain to climb. On June 5th, Weisner trudged out of base camp with a line of climbers behind him. They picked their way up the glacier, weighed down by tents and sleeping bags, shovels and coils of rope, food, stoves, and canisters of gas. The Sherpas carried 50 pounds each, the Sahibs 35. The language of war is often used to describe what mountaineers do. Expeditions launch assaults on a mountain. Climbers attack a rock wall or a steep ice slope. An army of porters pack supplies to base camp. If the 1939 expedition was on a military mission, This was the beginning of the siege. Like Houston the year before, Weisner planned to establish a line of camps up the ridge with about 1,000 feet of climbing between each camp. Each step of the way, an advance party would press ahead and find a location barely level enough to keep a couple of tents from sliding off the mountainside. Along the route, they would place fixed ropes to help the rest of the expedition through the most exposed sections of the climb. The others would then ferry loads up from the camp below while 2 or 3 climbers went on to scout the next location. Weisner had one hard and fast rule. He wanted every camp fully stocked with food and sleeping bags. Rarely did K2 get more than 4 days of clear skies in a row. The weather had been kind to Houston the year before, but storms could easily roll in and trap climbers for days. Weisner had known the German climbers who were forced into the deadly blizzard on Nanga Parbat in 1934. He wanted to make sure his own expedition could take shelter for as long as they needed in any camp. On June 7th, the team had spent 3 days in a row hauling loads up the glacier from base camp. They still had more than 10,000 feet of climbing to go. But already the altitude made each load feel heavier than normal. At 17,000 feet, each breath gave them only half the oxygen they would get in New Hampshire or New York. At the end of the day, Durant sank into his tent and picked up his diary. "There is no expression to describe how awful I felt physically today," he confessed. "Backache, short-winded, and despondent spirits." 2 days later, Durant was at it again, following Weisner to Camp 2. The route was steep, and Weisner led the climb. For 3 hours, Durant stood below him, paying out rope, while Weisner hacked steps into the ice and pounded pitons into cracks in the rock face. Durant was still waiting on a pair of heavy-duty mountain boots he'd ordered from Switzerland. All he had were a pair of thin, low-altitude climbing boots, and they made him feel like he didn't belong on the mountain. The traction was so poor he had to take extra care with every step, and the cold made the cheap leather feel like paper. Belaying Weisner on the slope, he wiggled his toes constantly to keep frostbite from settling in. Finally, by midday, they found the sheltered spot where Houston had set Camp 2 the year before. They dropped their loads and headed back to Camp 1, fumbling to get down in his inferior boots. Durant watched while Weisner scampered down the slope and disappeared below. Kukuli stayed behind to see Durant back to camp. When they arrived, Weisner was ready with an explanation. "I just wanted to see if you could take care of yourself," he said. It seemed irresponsible for Weisner to test him like that in the middle of a dangerous climb, but in the privacy of his own tent, Durant wondered if Weisner was right. The altitude snapped his energy, his boots ate away at his confidence. Maybe he wasn't up to the task. At times, the mountain seemed to be threatening them with evil intent. Below Camp 1, the glacier popped and groaned underfoot like a living being. The noise made everyone uneasy. Durant was convinced the ground was about to yawn open under his tent and swallow him alive. See how much, if we could maybe finish a couple more of these pages. I think we're going to go, yeah, we might try to finish a couple more. A week later, the team still hadn't made it past Camp 2, and Weisner was beginning to feel that his suspicions were right. They couldn't get along without him. He didn't trust anyone but himself to lead the climbs. He would have to find the routes up the mountain, cut steps into the steepest ice slopes, anchor ropes to protect the climbers carrying loads. It was exhausting work, and it meant he would rarely be around to organize the supply trips from below. He had left that job to Tony Cromwell, but Cromwell wasn't getting it done. A storm kept him trapped at Camp 1 one day. Another day, he claimed the Sherpas didn't want to work. At 19,000 feet, there were plenty of reasons not to climb higher. Each morning, it took every bit of willpower the men had to get out of bed. Moisture from their breath had settled on everything in the tents and frozen solid. Boots and sleeping bags had to be thawed. Snow had to be melted for tea. Outside, the wind howled and steep slopes of rock and ice loomed. Tony Cromwell had plenty to complain about, and Dudley Wolfe was at the top of his list. On June 16th, Weisner was down in base camp attending to some business. Cromwell, Durant, and Wolfe roped up to descend from Camp 2 to 1 and bring a load back up. Wolf struggled, especially on the way down. He measured every step as though it could be his last. By the end of the day, the slow pace of the climb was driving Cromwell crazy. Both he and Durrance lashed out at Wolf. The yachtsman was a poor excuse for a mountaineer, they told him. He didn't belong on K2. Wolf defended himself. He was doing his share of the work, carrying just as much weight and climbing just as high, and he did it without complaining, which was more than he could say for the others, especially Durrance. If he was slow, that was only because he had respect for the mountain and its dangers. When Durrance sat down to write in his diary that night, he expressed his doubts about Wolf. Dudley was sensitive to criticism about his climbing technique, he wrote. This trip in mountaineering is simply a bit more than he expected. But after 3 weeks on the mountain, Wolf was turning into the most reliable climber on the team, at least when he was pointed in the direction Wisner cared about most, up. Before he left base camp for the series push up the mountain, George Sheldon sent off a letter to the AAC summing up the team's progress. He put a positive spin on everything, neglecting to mention that Kramer had almost died. When he got to Wolf, he reported, Dudley is up on the mountain and you can't get him to come down. Weeks later, when those words reached New York, they would have a much different meaning than when they were written. Let's stop there, page 73, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. Thanks so much, ninth graders. Hope you're enjoying this book, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.